thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
There are, as you all know, a lot of long-term questions I have for you, but I figured the first place that we start, given your view of the financial health of so many Americans, how do you think about the next 6 to 12 months as they navigate this macro environment that looks to be facing a recession?
Yeah. Well, again, it's a pleasure to be here. When I think about the overall economy right now, clearly it's strong. When you look at the underlying fundamentals, we're in a strong economy, but there's some real headwinds when you think about inflation, when you think about rates continuing to rise, when you think about the broader geopolitical environment, we still are battling a war, et cetera. So what does that mean in terms of what we're seeing? We do anticipate a mild recession the latter part of the year going into the first quarter. But I think what's most important as someone who runs a company that exists to ensure millions of Americans can have a secure retirement, what we are seeing right now and what we will expect to continue to see is that 25% of Americans have reduced their contribution towards their retirement plan. And within that 25%, 50% have taken it down to zero. And so when you think about an environment where rates are so high, inflation is still high, it has real short-term, but also long-term impacts as we think about what that will mean for millions of Americans on their path to having, confidence in their retirement.
You know, it's interesting. You see a very different view when the banks think about savings and deposit rates going up. The reality, too, is you're seeing Americans not only contribute less, but dip into their retirement.
Yeah. And it's a real problem. I mean, just to kind of anchor on some key stats, there's a $4 trillion savings gap in our country. We know that 40% of Americans run out of money. We know that women retire with 30% less. And when you look at people of color, 54% of African Americans are not saving enough to retire. And so when you think about that backdrop, and when you hear stats that within that today, people are taking down their contribution and some are depleting, it will have a long-term impact that I would say we're in a crisis as we think about real risk for the average American.
It's interesting. Let's talk about the here and now, because if you look on Wall Street, people say, okay, inflation is coming down, but it's still high.
Yes.
And, actually I want to pull up a poll here to kind of talk a little bit about whether we've even seen the worst effects of them. The questions is, will there be aftershocks? Are we in the clear? Or are there new problems coming when you look at the inflationary picture for Americans?
Is that the result? I've never been in a room with
consensus.
Yeah.
No, but we'll let people
Okay,
answer a little more. I think this new problems are coming. It's an interesting idea here. Let alone if we're out of the woods or not. I mean, the idea that we're still in a prolonged inflationary environment. How is that impacting consumers in particular? Because Wall Street doesn't really get a view of the whole consumer picture here.
Yeah, I mean, if you just think about the everyday needs of people, how they are filling up their gas tank, the price of food, the cost of clothes, whatever that is, that impacts their overall financial picture. And so when you hear stubborn inflation is still high, we're already seeing the impact on the average consumer. To have people go into their retirement plan and reduce their contribution because they're making an impossible trade-off is a concern. And when you think about what does that mean, that means they're taking income that they're going to get taxed on. So that dollar is not a full dollar. And they're losing the compounding value over decades. So the real question for us is when people are making those tough choices today, specifically in a high inflationary environment, how do we make sure that as we're navigating through this cycle, that they can get back on track? So it's not just about the here and the now and the decision that an average American is making today. It is also about what do we do to help that average American get back on track to make sure that they can make better investment choices through the long term in order to make sure that they can have a secure retirement.
I do want to get into this idea of what companies and the government can do about this problem. But before we get there, I want to kind of outline the disparities we see here. There's this sense out there that inflation is not impacting everybody equally. Right. So what does that look like when you look at the American demographic, and what are the ripple effects of that type of widening inequality?
Well, I mean, we know, and history has told us, is that whenever we are in an environment of economic uncertainty, it can have an exacerbated impact for different populations, particularly people of color. And again, when you look at the first stat, 40% of all Americans, and then you have 54% of African Americans, and we know the impact for women retiring with 30% less. these issues compound. And one of the fundamental questions I think we all ask ourselves that are committed in wanting to close the economic gap, the inequalities, well, if we are not dealing with the long-term implications for retirement, then that debt is being transferred to their children. Those issues become compounding, which is less disposable income to put back into the economy because you're taking care of mom or dad's basic needs. So I do think it's an issue that we all have to understand and address, and understand the decisions that people are making today. How will that impact decisions tomorrow? How does that have a disproportionate impact in people of color and women? And then what decisions do we need to make in policy as well as in business to have better outcomes?
It's interesting that you put the burden transferred generationally. There are some that would also say that that burden also gets transferred to the U.S. government.
Yes.
We started today talking a lot about kind of the U.S. debt load, how unsustainable it is. You know, how do you think about the responsibility of governments here versus corporations when you think about Americans' financial health?
Well, I don't look at it as an or, I look at it as an and. You know, we know that good policy matters, especially when you're thinking about long-term investment solutions. And when you ask the question about Social Security, we know that Social Security was never designed to be the full replacement for someone's retirement. But the reality is, a large percentage of Americans are relying on almost 90% of Social Security to cover all of their financial needs, which is not sufficient. And so when I think about the role, I think about it in a couple dimensions. One, we need Social Security, and so hopefully we'll figure out how to address the entitlement and what does that mean. But there's real risk that it could be less. And we also know that we have longevity risk in our country. People are living longer, which will put another strain on the government. And so as we think about business, as we think about the investment community, as I think about being the CEO of TIAA, I think about how do we look at the allocation and talk about low-cost in-plan annuities as part of that overall portfolio when you think about not just stocks and bonds, but you think about guaranteed income in a low-cost way. I think about what employers can do to say, do we have a strong 401k or 403b plan? But it's not enough to say that we have those benefits. I think we also have to ask the question, are all of our employees participating in the plan at all levels? Are they all enrolling? And are they all increasing that percentage so that they can have confidence that they have enough, coupled with Social Security and then coupled with their broader investment portfolio? So good policy matters, and I am encouraged when you think about Secure Act 1.0 and 2.0, it was bipartisan. So we need more bipartisan conversations because this is an American issue. And then we also need business to continue to make sure that the plans that we are providing for our workers are working hard for them while they're working so that they can have confidence later that they can have a secure retirement.
How much of this is a call to action for the private sector to step it up? If you're running a business, there are a lot of things you're thinking about right now.
I think it's a big question. The good news is we all know that business matters when it comes to health benefits, when it comes to retirement benefits. We understand the importance. It's not just the wages, it's also about the benefits that we provide in order to be able to attract and retain talent. And so it is a call to action. It's a call to action because we know with all the great work that business has done, it's not sufficient when the outcome is 40%. And so when I think about basic practical steps, I would suggest a few things. One, make sure that the plan is working. Disaggregate the data. Are the people furthest removed from you investing in your 401k plan or 403b plan? Auto-enroll. Auto-escalate 1% every year to get to that maximum contribution. Clearly, the employee has the option if they need to opt out, but then next year you opt them back in. And we know studies show that when you do that, you have stronger outcomes. And then lastly, I think we cannot have this conversation without talking about education. How do we make sure that we are informing and taking the opportunity to educate our employees about the benefit, about what does it mean to have a secure retirement, and to make sure that they understand that making sure that they are secure puts a less burden on their loved ones that they care about. So there's a really important role that we play in business. And then finally, policy. I think in the business community, we have to continue to encourage Congress, to encourage the federal government to operate in a bipartisan way, to continue to provide solutions that can make it easier for the average American and easier for business to make sure that people can be on a path to a secure retirement.
You know, we started this conversation off talking about that stat that 40% of Americans run out of money.
Yep.
And if you look at the stats, the real survey here that is coming out, either most people in the audience believe that there will either be aftershocks and inflation or that new problems are coming.
Yeah.
What makes that 40%, 50%, or 60% or even more? I mean, are you worried about the direction of travel here?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely worried, but I also have optimism because we're in it for the fight. You know, we are committed to making sure that we can do our part to improve the outcome. But when you look at these stats, you have to be concerned because if we continue to have a high inflationary period, if everything continues to cost more, if wages are not keeping up with the cost of in the rise of inflation, then the average person has to make decisions for the short term that can have longer term implications. And so I think it's important for us to continue to make sure that we're looking at the after potential effects of inflation. I think we absolutely have to make sure we're not just thinking about the here and now, but what are people doing and what are those behaviors that people are acting today and what can that mean in the long term? Because we will have a crisis in our country if we are not making better decisions today to make sure that people can have all the solutions and the tools that they need to retire.
I want to talk a little more about some of the hot button issues in the market as well, because I know that you have a pretty nuanced takes to them. We've been talking so much. Everyone's going to be talking about artificial intelligence today, let's be honest. But you know, when you think about how you're running your business on it, TIAA is a private company, what are the ways you're using it and what are the ways you're most concerned?
I mean, AI has been here. It's here, and it's only going to continue to grow in terms of what it means to business. The way I think about it is I think the way that many of us think about it, clearly the benefits of AI is improved productivity. There's opportunities to make it easier to delight the client experience. There's ways to be the companion to the employees that you have so that some of the baseline work can be not what they have to focus on so they can work on, you know, higher complex issues and making sure that you have a reskilling program in place as you think about the jobs of tomorrow. But I also think given that we are a long-term investor and given that we are working with participants all ages, all the way through the transfer of wealth, we have to be concerned about risk. And so I think as we continue to invest in technology, as we all continue to get smarter about AI, I think it has to run a parallel path to really running what are all the risk scenarios. I think the investments that we make in technology, whether it's cyber or other risk tools, cannot just be the protection of yesterday's risks. It's not even enough to make sure that you're investing for the today's risk. We are making investments to thinking about tomorrow. What are the implications of ChatGPT? What are the implications in terms of account takeover? What are the implications in terms of imposters coming in and they sound like your daughter, they know your behavior, and then they're taking your money? So I think there are real risks that we have to make sure that we're focused on while we also are taking advantage of what the advantages of this technology can mean in terms of the company that, you know, that I run.
How often is some of that actually happening right now?
I mean, it's here. I mean, cyber risk is a real risk. When you think about fraud, when you think about people wanting to take advantage of the elderly community is one of the sectors that are most prime for abuse. And so making sure that we're communicating with our participants, making sure we're communicating with their loved ones. This is a risk that's happening today. And the risk will only become more amplified as we think about the sophistication of technology. And so that is why I think it's important that when we're having the conversation about AI or any technology, especially in the investment community, at the same time, we have to have the conversation about risk to make sure that we are doing both, taking advantage of what can be good for business, but it's not good if it's not protecting ultimately who we serve. And so we have to strike the balance.
Do you think that many companies are kind of being very naive to some of those risks on the surface?
I don't. I mean, whether it's the Business Council, the Business Roundtable, I mean, any environment that I'm in talking with other colleagues, this is top of mind. And it's top of mind with respect to innovation. It's top of mind with respect to what does it mean to the workplace and the workforce. And it's top of mind for all of us as we think about the different risks that it can mean to our business. So I do think that we're not being naive. I think we want to become more knowledgeable about the use cases across our company. But I think any good leader wants to also understand, how do I make sure that I'm also protecting the company and the people that we serve?
We started this conversation talking about this idea of a mild recession on the horizon. How would you help the audience here anchor their minds into what are the things that investors are not seeing, the biggest risks that you're thinking about right now as we think through the next 6 to 12 months?
I mean, the good news, I think we're all talking about the same thing. And I think investors are looking at the macro environment, but I also think investors are looking at what does it mean to the balance sheet of everyday Americans, or regardless, in terms of all the decisions that we have to make. I think when we look at a mild recession, I mean, clearly the labor market continues to be strong. You know, I think clearly unemployment continues to be low. So I think the piece that we're trying to all reconcile is how can you continue to have a strong labor market, lower employment, and be able to bring down inflation at the same time. I think clearly some of the nuances that I know we're all talking about is there's different sectors that are being impacted, whether it's commercial real estate. I think there's a question about credit. Will credit tighten? And if credit tightens, what implications will that have as we think about investment options? But I think the core fundamentals are continuing to be strong. I think we all understand what's happening in the environment. But I do think these unknowns are ones that we're going to have to continue to navigate. And I think the most important thing that I would share, given the space that I'm in, is making sure that as we think about the long term, particularly for those when you're thinking about their allocation for retirement, are we doing everything that we can to make sure that within their portfolio they have access and exposure to guaranteed income? And
into a potential recession, this idea that Americans are dipping into their savings to get through the cycle, is the consumer as strong as everybody thinks?
Yeah, I mean, it's uneven. I think, on one hand, people are sitting with a lot of cash on the sideline. And on the other hand, there's everyday Americans that are making, real tough decisions on how to access cash. And so I think we cannot just look at the macro numbers. I think we have to recognize that it's uneven. And I think as we're navigating this environment, there will continue to be stress on that average consumer. And depending on what happens in a prolonged potential recession, those implications can be exacerbated. And I think that's something we have to continue to watch.
Thasunda, thank you so much.
Thank you very much
for your time.